It's time to feel the hypnosis in Map19 The Spiral. This has to be the most basic and relatively disappointing of Doom 64's maps. It's literally just a trek upstairs and through a teleporter. While it's still not a breeze, thanks to the abundance of enemies like the Pain Elemental, the map itself is very much lacking other than cool-looking 3D segments of the tower. The map called Even Simpler almost feels like a sprawling labyrinth compared to this one. It very much feels like it was made for filler. Ultimately, it didn't leave me angry, but it did leave me a bit disappointed by the lack of meat. I think there could have been more. It's time to lose our minds in Map32 Hectic. Basically, this is the Trickster Prepare to Die map. Think tricks and traps from Doom 2 on super ultra steroids. The green armor at the beginning is feasible from a certain direction, but the Soul Sphere and blue armor are pretty much impossible without extremely sensitive movements. The whole purpose of the map really is to get all 3 keys from the dangerous areas so you can get the alternative exit to get the features menu option, which is basically cheats. With Hell Knights, Arachnotrons, and all kinds of hazards, it certainly leaves an impression. It's time to delay the inevitable in Map24 No Escape. This is the most boss gauntlet feeling out of any of the maps, even the one that introduces cyber demons. While there are a few things to grab, for the most part it's killing 3 cyber demons and maybe other things in the room. It makes the map feel relatively shallow, one of the more shallow in Doom 64 as a whole, and the challenge doesn't make up for it. About the only incentive to really look around is to grab a few things like a Soul Sphere and blue armor. Ultimately, it's a map that doesn't really offer much other than the intrinsic difficulty of these monsters, which I can't really give the map itself credit for. It's time to wield a comically large mallet in Map25 Cat And Mouse. Yeah, there really isn't much to say about this. It's pretty much a small maze with nightmare imps and a cyber demon. I suppose the most charitable way I can describe it is it's like a much more intense version of the Tower of Babel due to tight corners. Naturally, the map design itself is the weakest element, but at least it has the twist of the cyber demon having lines it can teleport between to catch you off guard. All you really get for defense is a rocket launcher too. Ultimately, it's very much a gimmick map, but it's just deemed a fun map, so it's not like it's meant to be taken seriously. It's time to take it up to 11 in Map26 Hardcore. It's basically the same concept as Cat and Mouse, but with some dead simple thrown in before the cyber demon shows up. By that, I mean it's covered in Arachnotrons and Mancubi and is still a very basic design. I get that there's supposed to be gauntlet levels, but much like Fortress of Mystery, it just doesn't appeal to me. I prefer maps that are more exploratory, not a very tight challenge run, as amusing as it can be in a short-lived way. This one has more of a wrinkle to it, but I still can't say it's worth much more than a light shrug. It's time to beware the big brood in Map30 The Lair. Honestly, this one's a relatively short map. Not as short as Fortress of Mystery, but still a bit lacking compared to other maps. This sequence to get the demon key for the Unmaker is probably the one interesting part, having to shoot 2 appearing switches. Kinda weird that Arachnotrons have only been in secret maps so far though, not even in the Dead Simple homage. Apparently the map also has a key-triggered line to access the exit switch, which is interesting and different, but it really doesn't stop the rest of the map from being so unremarkable. It's time to lower our standards in Map 9 Even Simpler. As the name suggests, it's similar to Dead Simple and starts out much the same in a courtyard with Mancubi. You quickly discover, however, that it's not quite the same because it has waves of Hell Knights, Barons, Pain Elementals, and additional Mancubi to replace Arachnotrons. It does give you an invulnerability sphere to dull the pain, but still feels a fair bit tougher than the original Dead Simple, not to mention looking much more graphically intricate. Ultimately, it's still a short map, but one with a good amount of difficulty and twists over the Doom 2 original. It's time to play Ring Around the Lost Souls in Map27 Playground. Admittedly, of these gimmick fun maps, this is my favorite among them since it does something kinda different. It starts with Arachnotrons in pitch black with partial invisibility spheres and you have to dance around them. It moves on to a cyber demon, which I figured would be the finale, but it graduates with Mancubi. Even if it's technically the same enemy makeup as Hardcore and a smaller map, it at least has a wrinkle on that gives it a new feeling. I can at least give it credit for that. It's still a short gauntlet map, but it has something unique and it left a positive impression. It's time to grab a magazine in Map 4 Holding Area. This map doesn't have that much new, at least if you've been through Hectic, but it does have a very unique secret exit involving a combo of switches. The rest of the map is just fine, making use of a shootable switch if you want a chain gun and just generally being around the same level of challenge as the previous one. I wouldn't say it's as interesting as previous maps, it's not bad by any means, but it feels more like an in-between map. Ultimately, it's still a solid map and has some nice looking designs in the larger areas. It's time to break out the flashlights at Map 15 Dark Entries. This is another map that's short and linear but very intense, even homing rocket launches at the start akin to a Revenant. Since you have to pass through it at least 3 different times, it can get dicey, especially with other enemies around to pose a distraction. The courtyard area past the blue door is the highlight since it's fairly large and has a variety of Arachnotrons, Hell Knights, and Barons to keep you moving. Ultimately, it's a pretty short and linear map, but it has difficulty going for it and has some interesting twists and turns. It's time for a Vampire's Delight in Map10 The Bleeding. This map is a little too basic, essentially going back and forth between some waves of enemies. Not to say it's anything bad, it provides a good challenge, and some of the aesthetics like the water cavern are nice, but it could be something more. One nice thing about the map is it gives you the BFG and a fairly easy to figure out secret too, even if I never felt I had to use it there. It centers around a small castle and it has enough to keep you on your toes, but it feels like more could have gone into making it more complete as a map. It's time to redirect boxes in Map 1 staging area. If there's one map I'd compare it to, it's the entryway from Doom 2, except in many ways this is actually much more complex. The most noteworthy example is you have to shoot all 10 explosive barrels and quickly make it to a secret to gain access to a secret map. Talk about cryptic! My only real complaint is shotgunners looking way too much like the pistol enemies, and that's not on the map but on Doom 64's design. It does a good job introducing you to some Doom 64 mechanisms such as conveyor belts and Duke 3D-esque light cycles. For a starter map, it more than fulfills its task as setting the stage, if you'll pardon the pun. It's time to embrace the darkest dark in Map 31 In the Void. This is definitely a map that goes much more for style than substance since it's technically narrow corridors for the most part. It's also the part for the last demon key, turning the Unmaker into a straight up spread gun if you already got the previous ones. It also makes very liberal use of pain elementals along with their very aggressive lost souls, so this is a map that's willing to hurt as much as help. From a gameplay perspective, the map isn't much special, but it's that visual element that really excels it. Sort of reminds me of GoldenEye's Cradle with that in the clouds aspect. It's time for ultimate assignment in Map 29 Outpost Omega. Mostly the map seems pretty standard fare, minus introducing pain elementals and possibly Mancubi if you're on the highest difficulty. However, it has a surprisingly interesting web of platforms with secrets such as Blue Armor, Soul Sphere Backpack, and unique to Doom 64 at the time, the Unmaker. Pain elementals are pretty nuts in Doom 64. It must have known about the melee range exploit, so if Lost Souls can't spawn, they just blow up instead. The map itself is really elevated by that system of platforms and allows an otherwise alright secret map to really shine. It's time to unleash the Holy Flamethrower in Map 22 Burnt Offerings. This map arguably hits its peak early on in the courtyard and then never quite reaches that point, though that's not a condemnation of it. The most noteworthy part about the map is getting the blue key since it requires you to press a switch to open a door and then another to drop a lift so you can reach it in time. The trap getting the rocket launcher was also unexpected. You certainly don't want to keep any of the surrounding enemies alive before you grab it. Overall, it's not one of the better maps, but at least it has a few tricks up its sleeve to keep things from getting dull. It's time for some manufactured scares in Map 18 Spawned Fear. If nothing else, it's got a good amount of variety, from a switch shooting puzzle to get a key to a tight cage maze to a trek through boiling blood. Probably a visual highlight is skulls shifting up and down above a grate of nuclear waste. It's another linear map, but it has some good architecture, and it of course caught me off guard a number of times. The cliffside area certainly makes good use of heights, even if it's a little cramped, and while the secret exit isn't too hard to figure out, it's also easy to miss. Overall, nothing mind-blowing, but it compensates with interesting twists. It's time to pursue some French spies in Map 3 Main Engineering. This map is a bit on the smaller side, but it ups the ante with some cool scripting sequences and of course gives you the mighty double-barrel shotgun. In exchange for that double barrel, there's also nightmare imps, cacodemons, and very aggressive though thankfully fragile lost souls. Figuring out the red key was back at the blue key area wasn't entirely obvious, but nothing more than a brief bit of confusion for me, so no harm done. Ultimately, it's another good map that brings some new things to the table, but I wouldn't say it's the best so far. It's time to indulge in the madness in Map 20 Breakdown. This one's mildly memorable in the sense that it's at least got an interesting maze to navigate through for a bit of exploration. Though other than that, in the initial courtyard, it's mostly hallways and small rooms full of enemies, so I can't say it's especially packed for content. It has an unexpected point of no return, which I'm never the biggest fan of, but at least that's only from the beginning, so you don't miss out on too much. Overall, it feels more on the alright side of the spectrum. It has a moderate amount of content, but it's hardly going to be topping any lists. It's time to game over this unit in Map 8, Final Outpost. From start to finish, this is definitely a map of trickery and deception. Floors falling, enemies appearing, a tricky key, even an optional plasma rifle you have to be good with spatial awareness to be able to grab successfully. There's a good amount of barrens though, especially at the exit where your ability to dodge them isn't the best. While it's a lot more fleshed out than Hectic though, it still feels relatively short and gimmicky compared to other maps. That being said, I still view it in a favorable light. There's enough here to hold your attention and it has some tricks up its sleeve. It's time to go where no man has gone before in Map 6 Alpha Quadrant. This map introduces the Baron of Hell, so tougher, differently colored Hell Knight like in the original Doom. It also makes perhaps the most complex use of scripting yet, having an elaborate floor raising system for bridges and to create the illusion of 3D floors. Figuring out you ironically have to not strafe run to get the Soul Sphere secret I found funny since I'm used to just using it to pick up speed. Not the most complex map in the world, but it has some interesting new concepts and does just enough to increase difficulty. It's time to be set free in Map28 The Absolution. The intended way to play this map is pretty cool, waves of enemies followed by the Mother Demon herself. She's the one demon, not counting environmental hazards, that has a homing attack in Doom 64, so she's fairly threatening. However, if you have the demon keys, you can barricade the teleporters and then melt the Mother Queen with a fully upgraded Unmaker. It's almost like getting the Fierce Deity mask in Zelda Majora's Mask, trivializing the final boss if you went through the effort. I can't really be harsh on it though, since normally it's a very satisfying boss fight, even if it's a very simplistic map design. It's time to face the Black Knight in Map 13 Dark Citadel. This map had the toughest challenge yet. A whole flurry of darts getting through to a blue key makes it next to impossible to avoid taking a chunk of damage. Interesting little maze underground too, and certainly threw me for a loop with knights and barons. In general, this map has plenty of tricks up its sleeve, from firing darts at you around corners to a shotgun trap with enemies waiting to attack. It's a bit on the linear side, which I'm not a fan of, but it definitely wasn't boring. It's a good solid map that had some unexpected twists and turns, and that's a plus in my book. It's time for ultimate research in Map 5 Tech Center. This is certainly the lengthiest of the maps so far, though part of that is due to backtracking. In a way, the start is almost like tricks and traps, only a lot more directed since most of the areas are either locked doors or have something you need to switch to access. Notable features are a maze leading to a series of crusher ceilings and a teleporter that becomes briefly activated when you press a switch, forcing you to run to it. Overall, I wouldn't say it's my favorite map, but it still has a good amount of content in it, so I'll give it credit for packing in the meat. It's time to face our fears in Map 11 Terror Core. I actually really enjoyed this one and made extensive use of an outdoor environment as well as a castle with a watery moat. The blue armor and soul sphere secrets weren't too hard to figure out, but they were very satisfying when I worked out how to get to them. It takes the 3D floor game to the next level with bridges you can both see above and below while you're traversing it, and it's as impressive as the best of Duke 3D's trickery. All in all, it's a pretty beefy map with enough room for exploration to never feel overly linear, and it was a thrilling ride through and through. It's time to grab some beakers and cook in Map07 Research Lab. In terms of both style and substance, this map is definitely very favorable in my book. It feels tight but just spacious enough and makes great use of the 3D floor illusion. It also has an interesting maze leading to a security camera floor raise. It also has nukage pits, which only strengthens the feeling that it's a classic Doom and is just a nice spiderweb of rooms and hallways in general. The only thing negative I can even think of to levy against it is it doesn't have as extensive use of scripts as some other maps. It's time to swing over bottomless holes in Map21 Pitfalls. I can see how it got its name. The beginning seems relatively cramped before stairs unfold and it shows you a decently sized cavern underneath. Doom 64 never really reaches the scale of Doom 2's larger maps, but they can certainly get large enough to get a good sense of scale, and this is one of them. Between the cavern and the shorter area after it, it's almost like a condensed form of the Living End, which is a compliment. I'd say it's overall a nice map with a nice mix of more open and smaller areas to give it some sense of depth. It's time to ground pound in Map3 The Terraformer. This is definitely a map to show off Doom 64's scripting, not least of which the titular terraformer that straight up pounds into the ground. The map as a whole is a nice escalation over staging area with crusher ceilings, a tricky teleporting key, and some nice outdoor environments. Even has some nightmare specters showcasing their difference to the OG Dooms with real transparency. If staging area is entryway, then this is definitely the underhalls, really showing off what Doom 64 can do and just taking things to the next level in many ways. It's time to avoid the red stains in Map 16, Bloodkeep. It's kind of funny, the maps revolving around castles with moats tend to be on the better side, and this is no exception. It doesn't feel quite as open-ended as some previous maps, but it has a healthy amount of indoor and outdoor areas and keeps a good sense of scale. The trap leading into the exit was also pretty dastardly, especially the sudden floor shift when it was over. The game can really keep you on your toes sometimes. Ultimately, it's a good map and both has that exploration and experiencing the same areas from different heights that Doom is known for. It's time to pull a Wile E. Coyote in Map 17, Watch Your Step. If Map 9 is an homage to Dead Simple, this feels like one to Tower of Babel, even a central tower introducing the Cyber Demon, 2 on the hardest difficulty. Of course, there's more than that, an area prior with a variety of enemies and a loop around in addition to waves before the Cyber Demon itself. By the standards of a regular map, I'd say it's pretty short, but it's one of the better boss introduction maps, and I'd even place it above Phobos Anomaly. While I wouldn't say it's one of the best, it does the job it sets out to do very well, and the architecture looks nice too. It's time to feed into the Big M in Map 12, Altar of Pain. This is the crappiest map I've played so far, and I don't mean I didn't like it, I actually love it. I mean, that is some suspicious looking brown sludge there. This is exactly the kind of map I want to see more of, a great big map with a castle surrounded by a moat, and it really has a nice sense of scale. Exploring around and finding the next area to go to as you scale the walls is also pretty satisfying, as is finding the secret exit. In short, this map is actually quite exceptional, both in depth and in overall places I can go exploring around in. It's time for some wicked sermons in Map 23, Unholy Temple. This is another one of those big moated castle maps, and while it's a little linear in key progression, it follows the trend of being one of the better maps. It genuinely has a pretty creative puzzle where the 3 keys are switches that must be pressed in a certain order corresponding to how they appear next to bars. It's obviously not meant to be the most difficult to figure out, but it reminds me of the combination switch puzzles on Duke 3D. With a fairly big sense of scale and the danger of homing missiles, it's a memorable map and makes good use of scripting events too. It's time to prepare for the worst of it, Map 14, Eye of the Storm. Well, this map is true to its namesake because it definitely feels like you're facing a mighty storm of enemies on all sides. Lost souls especially are a big pain if you don't have bullets for the chain gun, and having a few pain elementals certainly add to the chaos. The justifiable difficulty aside, it's a pretty nice and spacious map, similar to Altar of Pain, but with a much nicer looking aesthetic with water instead of brown sludge. I can't really find much fault in this map, especially by the standards of Doom 64 maps. It's time to overview the depths of hell yet again. I've heard Doom 64 deemed the true Doom 3, and I can kind of see why. It merges an unsettling aesthetic with the same great Doom action. While I wouldn't say it's up to the level of Doom 2 or Final Doom for map scale, it still manages to have some pretty impressive maps. Even the worst maps weren't so much terrible as disappointing, and it generally does a great job showing off its scripting capabilities all throughout. While it lacks in new enemies apart from the final boss, it more than makes up for it with a great new weapon, especially when upgraded, and some spectacular maps.